Good evening, everybody. I want to take a moment to express my appreciation to all of you for stepping in tonight for our study. As we continue our study of the empires and idols of the Bible, we've been talking about different empires that interact with God's people throughout the Bible, names that we oftentimes read. We know a little bit about them, but maybe not a lot about them. So far in our study, we have talked about the Egyptians. We've talked about several of the Canaanite countries, the Hittites and the Moabites and other countries like that. We've talked about the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Tonight we're going to move into the Persians. So let's take just a moment, if you will, to go to God in prayer. Our Father, thank you so much for the night that you've given us, the time that you've given us to come together with one another through the internet and study with one another. Pray that you'll grant us wisdom. Help us as we read about these countries, in particular tonight, the Persians. Help us to think about how you worked in the affairs of humanity to bring about your purposes, and how, as powerful as countries may be, you are a more powerful God, and we rejoice in that. May we remember that even today, that you're more powerful than anything that we could ever face, and you will deliver those who are yours, as you did back in biblical times. Help us, dear Father, to trust in you. Bless us now with wisdom. Take care of us all, we ask, in your Son's name. Amen. Well, in Daniel chapter 5, we are told of an event where the King Belshazzar of the Babylonian Empire, the regent at that point, Nebuchadnezzar was the king at that point. As regent, Belshazzar was ruling there in Babylon. And the very night we find taking place there in Daniel chapter 5, as a great party was taking place, and Belshazzar was showing his wealth to everyone else. And there was a finger that began to write on the wall, and it was a judgment against the Babylonians. And Daniel was brought in, and Daniel was the one who told, this is what the saying is. And ultimately the message was, your kingdom has been found wanting, and it will end. And that very night, the Bible tells us, the Babylonian Empire came to a conclusion so quickly. And the Persians, the Medes and the Persians, came into power at that point. To give you an idea of the time frame in which we are looking at the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians, we're looking at, and their interaction with the Israelites, three major empires interacting with the Israelites. Samaria, the northern kingdom major city, fell in 720 BC. And by 539 BC, when Persia begins to release the Jews back into the land of Jerusalem, you have less than 200 years. So within a period of less than 200 years, you have the Assyrians gaining power and asserting their power, the Babylonians coming into power, and the Persians coming into power. And briefly, it will be. Their power will fade very quickly as we move into next week, the Greeks. So you're looking at really, on a very large scale, a very small and very short period of time. And one of the things I need is my clicker. So hold on just a second. When you're showing slides, you got to have this. So, the Persians. When we start looking at the Persian Empire, here's a map. You've seen this same area with the Assyrians, with the Babylonians. You're dealing with world powers that take over the same region, one right after another. But the Persians began to expand it quite a bit. In fact, this is fascinating. I'll go ahead and tell you this now. It is believed by historians that the Persian Empire at its zenith held control over 50 million people. And it's believed by historians that the world at this point only had a population worldwide of 100 million people, which means that the Persian Empire controlled half of the earth's population. That's who we're dealing with when we deal with the Persians. Now, when we start looking at them from a biblical standpoint, the northern kingdom fell to the Assyrians, and when the Assyrians took over, you remember we talked about one of their policies was to deport people and import people from other countries. So they would deport, in order to break nationalism, they would deport people in a country to another country and make them live there, and they would bring people from other countries into that country that they had taken over. So from that came the Samaritans that we see as we look in the pages of the New Testament. That's where they came from. Well, one of the lands that they deported, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 6, The people of the northern kingdom, too, was the land of the Medes. In Isaiah 44, verses 28 through chapter 44, verse 4, 48, 14 through 15, King Cyrus is mentioned. Now, he's going to be the primary king of the Persian Empire, at least to get everything rolling and expand the empire. It became just an incredible empire under him. He is mentioned 150 years before he's born in Scripture. 150 years. Cyrus is mentioned by name. As he comes into power, hold on just a minute. Okay, sorry about that. As he comes into power, he began to free the Israelites. And this was one of the policies of Cyrus. We'll talk about this more in just a moment. But the exoduses from the Babylonian captivity began to go out, and they began to go back home to the nation of Judah and begin to rebuild. Cyrus also, when he sent these people back, contributed to the rebuilding of their temples because he felt like that would help the people be more docile toward him. So from the Persian coffers, he built temples to other gods in other countries in order to make these people happy. Probably one of the stories, two of the stories we know the best, aside from the story of Daniel and the interaction Daniel had with the Persian Empire after the Babylonians fell, Daniel chapter 6, is the story of Esther. She was a queen in the Persian Empire, 475 to 450 BC, and then the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah would have been the cupbearer to the king, to the Persian king that we know of as Artaxerxes. And he would have been the king there, and he would have been the one who helped Nehemiah go back and begin to rebuild the walls, 450, 430 BC. Now, let's talk about the Persians for a few moments. They sprang up from two groups, the Mada, or the Medes, and the Parsua, who are the Persians. These were Indo-Iranian people known as the Aryans. They did not refer to their land as Persia. That was what the Greeks referred to their land as. The Persians would have referred to their land as the land of the Aryans, or the Aryan Vega. And this is currently what we know to be, at least primarily, sprang from this area, Iran. So Aryan, Iran, that's where this came from. So this is geographically today where the Persian Empire began. The Medes dominated this area at first. You have the Medes and the Persians. At first, the Medes were the dominant force, and they were the first ones to begin to threaten the rule of the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. But it was Cyrus II who overthrew his grandfather, who was the king of the Medes, and began to express the dominance of the Persian people, 559, 530 BC. He took part in the destruction of Babylon. In 549 BC, he overthrew his grandfather, the king of the Medes, and this began what was known as the Achaemenid Empire. Not the empire of King Cyrus or the Syrian Empire. This goes back to a legendary figure in their history that Cyrus was pointing back to. And he was inflating his own worth by connecting himself to this legendary figure, and he began this great empire. And under this, as we said a moment ago, he began to take all the captives that the Assyrians and Babylonians, because the Babylonians inherited the captives of the Assyrians, he began to return all of these captives to their lands. This was not simply because he was a benevolent ruler, although history tells us that he was, but he was also a very practical and pragmatic ruler. And he understood that the best way to control people was to give them freedom so that they were happy. And so that's why when he sent them back, he gave funds from the Persian treasury so that people could begin to worship their own gods. They had to, of course, give a tribute, and he had different rulers and governors over different areas. But he began to show a great deal of tolerance, religious tolerance, appreciation for and tolerance for the religious values and the moral values of the different people that he governed. And as long as they sent in their tribute, everything was good. One of the characteristics that we find in the Persian Empire was an emphasis that was placed on honor and truth. In fact, historically, Cyrus is viewed to have been probably one of the best rulers of any country in world history. He was a model ruler in the way that he governed, the temperament that he showed, and the kindness he showed to different people. Once he died, his son, Cambyses II, began to rule, 530 to 522 BC. He began to expand the empire to the west, and he began to reach out to Egypt, and he brought Egypt under control. Some historians, Greek historians, referred to him as mad, killing other people, family members. That's debatable as to whether or not he really lived up to that record, but that is one of the charges made against him by the Greeks. You'll see why the Greeks didn't care for the Persians very much in just a moment. But during the time when he was attacking Egypt and he subjugated Egypt, he heard that there was a coup going on back at the Persian Empire, and he began to rush back. He died on the way back. It turned out his brother, by the name of Bardiya, who may not have been his brother. It is believed by some and recorded by some that he killed his brother, but at least it may have been an impostor. It may have been his real brother. It may have been an impostor. Someone claiming to be of the royal lineage overthrew him. He died before he got back. And this is where we begin to see King Darius. Darius was the one who was a general of the king Cambyses. And he steps in at that point and overthrows the impostor or the brother who had stepped in, and then he becomes the king, 521 to 486 BC. He ruled with a very, very strong hand. He did not put up with anyone who sought to resist him. He sought at that point to begin to expand his empire over into Greece. And in several battles, he failed, and he returned home. Then Xerxes, his son, 486 through 465 BC, who is Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. Okay, there's the biblical connection there. Xerxes I also tried to take Greek. And if you know anything about Greek history, you may remember the Battle of Thermopylae. In the Battle of Thermopylae, you had a handful of Greeks at the Pass of Marathon who held that pass. I think 300 Greeks. There were other soldiers who were there, but they were engaged in an overwhelming army, and they held that pass for days until a shepherd was bribed by the Persians to show them a way around the pass, and they came up behind and defeated them. But even then, they were not able to defeat the Greeks. So they went home in defeat at that point, and then King Xerxes was assassinated because of his failures. And from that point on, you have a series of very, very weak kings, one after another. And that brings about the fall of the Persian Empire to the Greeks, who had a very, very long memory. As we'll talk about next week, there arose a young general by the name of Alexander, who set his eyes on the world. And Alexander rose up in power. I want to share just some information with you because this is staggering. You will see next week, Alexander is spoken of in the book of Daniel, the little horn, right? He is part of God's prophetic plan. When the Persians and the Greeks began to fight with one another, some of the first battles, you had about 35,000 Greeks going against a force of 40,000 Persians. And when the battle was over, 20,000 Persians were dead, and only history tells us 115 Greeks were killed. Now, keep in mind, the Greeks were the one giving us these records, and history usually favors the victor. So whether it's really 115 or not, it's not really the issue, but it was an overwhelming defeat. Darius then went back and he gathered 600,000 soldiers and mercenaries, and as William Durant says in his book of history, Our Oriental History, with all the stupidity that destiny could require, Darius crossed the forces of Alexander, who had 30,000 men, 600,000 versus 30,000, on a field when all the Persian forces could not fight at once. And once again, when all was over, 450 Greeks lay dead, while 115,000 Persians were dead. And if that were not enough, Darius finally was able to gather a force of mercenaries of 1 million men. And Alexander, with 7,000 cavalry and 40,000 infantry, met the motley mob, Durant writes, and by superior weapons, generalship, and courage, destroyed all of them on that day. I want you to realize that. You're talking about an army of 1 million men going against 47,000. Truly, we see that there was something else working here to accomplish the fall of the Persian Empire. Darius III at this point was killed by some of his own generals, and the Persian Empire was swallowed up by the Greeks. And in his death, it is said that he was found at a stream by a Greek officer. After asking for water from the officer, Darius reportedly said, "This is the final stroke of misfortune, that I should accept a service from you and not be able to return it. But Alexander will reward you for your kindness, and the gods will repay him for his courtesy toward my mother and my wife and my children," who, by the way, have been captured by Alexander. "And so through you I give him my hand." And with that, Darius died, and with that also died the Persian Empire, started so brilliantly by Cyrus, but ending once again like the Babylonians in a whimper. Darius was killed by Persian generals, and the empire fell. At its height, I said a moment ago, 50 million people were under the power of the Persian Empire. What was their society like? Well, the government was known as the King of Kings, or the Shah of Shah. And those of you who are my age and older will remember in Iran, the Shah of Iran, the King of Iran. It's the same language there because you're dealing with that same Persian history there, the Shah of Shahs. His word, as we find in the book of Daniel, was irrevocable. When a law was passed, it could not be undone. At its height, it was divided into provinces ruled by governors who, as we find in the book of Daniel and history, were known as satraps. These were governors and military generals who ruled over areas to make sure that tribute was brought in as expected and the empire could continue. Militarily, they had very sophisticated divisions, spearmen, cavalry, archers, very distinct units. Men at ages 15 to 50, without exception, were made to go and fight. One story is told of a father of 5 children who were at war. He wanted his youngest one to be excused from fighting, and the king took him and cut him in two and put him on each side of the road that the soldiers walked through as a message: everyone does their part. Now, because later, as the king rallied forces and he began to hire mercenaries, their loyalty did not last. And because the empire was so diverse at that time, there was not a unifying culture, and the sense of solidarity of the soul of the fighting force began to fall apart, which probably to some degree begins to help us understand why Alexander, with such a small force, was able to overcome them so easily. As with most ancient cultures, most people were illiterate. Literacy on a worldwide level did not really increase until you get to the 19th and 20th century of the after Christ period of time, and just recently. Even in biblical times, you're looking at 3 to 20% literacy rate, New Testament times. Certainly, as you look at this time, it was not common at all. Education for those who did receive education was primarily for boys and men, ages 5 to 20 years old. Those who'd be working in the royal courts, and that's why Daniel and his friends were so enticing to serve in the courts there of the Babylonians and the Persians. They were primarily taught 3 things: to ride, to shoot, and to always tell the truth. Honor and truth, we talked about a moment ago. These were important things to the Persians. Legally, rewards and punishments were given in courts, and a good name was considered when someone was standing before a court. So if someone was accused of something, but they had a good reputation, well, that meant something, and that went a long way in solidifying their evidence, or at least in getting a verdict that was not guilty. Judges were expected to be honorable men. fact, one story I read told of a judge who had accepted bribes, and once it was found out that he accepted bribes, he was killed and skinned, and his skin was used to make the chair that the next judge who followed him sat in. So that would certainly encourage one to make sure when they sat on their predecessor that they did not make the same mistake that their predecessor made. Floggings and mutilations were very common. Murder, rape, and treason were punishable by death in various ways. Someone could be mutilated, their nose cut off, their ear cut off. Sometimes they were killed by having two stones. Their head was placed between two stones, and the stones swung in. That got the message across to everyone. You do not cross the law. Morally, truth and honor, again, were highly esteemed by the population. To reveal more than one's face, especially among women, and that's even carried over today. Some people think that's simply a Muslim characteristic. No, this goes back in Persian society. All the way back to this point, to reveal one's face, anything more than one's face was immodest. And certainly as you start looking in modern times, the covering even of the face is there. Drinking at state affairs was very common, and laws were passed. Durant said that they had to revisit those laws the next morning because sometimes the laws they passed were not the best laws, and they had to revisit them, but drinking was very, very common. Persians had a strong history of being very, very hospitable people towards everyone else, and homosexuality and abortion were punishable by death. As far as daily life goes in the Persian Empire, at least during the time of Cyrus and when the Jews were there in captivity, the book of Ezekiel there as well, personal vanity ruled the day, especially in the high courts. People made sure they smelled nice, and they made sure they looked nice, and they wore a lot of makeup and colorful clothing. But they made sure in every situation, even in battle, the king made sure he had perfume on him, because in case he was captured, he wanted to make sure he smelled nice. It was unseemly to blow one's nose in public or to eat in public. And they had high esteem for families, mothers and fathers, grandparents, and also for dogs. Dogs were considered part of our family. Maybe we've gone back to a little Persianness there in our lives because pets mean a lot to us today. Pets meant a lot to the Persians as well. They linked the empire, as with other empires, by these major highways from Sardis, which is on the far west side of what we now know to be Turkey, all the way into Susa, which was one of the primary cities of the Persian Empire. There was a major road known as the Royal Road. And that was one through which they began to have this impressive system by which they got mail all through the empire and carried it to those places where they needed to go. Religiously, they had several gods, as with most foreign empires and people of the day. For the longest time, the primary god was Mithra, who was the god of the sun. And this is very common too. You remember we studied Ra, who was the Egyptian god of the sun, and Baal, who was the storm god, and El, who was the god of the sun. So the idea of worshiping elements was even here a very practical thing. There's also Anahita, who is the Persian version of Ishtar. Ishtar was an Asherah, all the same entity there, goddess of love, goddess of fertility. And then there is what came to be the primary god of the Persian Empire, Ahura Mazda. He became known as the only god of the world. He was known as the Lord of Heaven, the Lord of Light. He was known to be an omniscient God, but not an all-powerful God. And the greatest prophet of Ahura Mazda, the greatest prophet was a prophet by the name of Zoroaster. We are not exactly sure when this prophet lived. Some people have suggested somewhere around 1000 BC. Others right around the time of King Cyrus. But King Cyrus was the one who within the Persian Empire, the Persian people, really began to push this religion of Zoroism to all the people. The great prophet, again, Ahura Mazda. He was given the Avesta, which was the religious book of this religion by Ahura Mazda, it is said, of course, from their legends. And there was in this line of religious practice 3 primary rules that people were to live by. First of all, they were to practice good thoughts. Then they were to express those good thoughts in good words. And primarily, they were to express those good thoughts and those good words in good deeds. Pretty good way to live, ultimately. The greatest value was purity and honesty, truth, honor. We've talked about that and how that influenced some of the kings there. They worshipped only one true God, and that was Ahura Mazda. That there were no other gods. This was a monotheistic religion that developed in the Persians. They believed in 6 periods of world creation, the creation of 2 people, everything coming from these 2 people. They believed in a flood story. And they also believed that there was this battle between good and evil. There was a dualism that took place between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And from the forces of good and evil, there were these emanations. The septa manu were the good emanations, and the angra manu were the evil manifestations that would come out, emanations that would come out. And everyone could fall sway to one of these, and everyone had to choose which one they were to follow. There are several things in there that in some ways, many have suggested became some of the seeds of Christianity. Zoroaster was believed to have been of divine origin, and some have come up and said, well, that's where Christianity got the idea that Christ is divine, and good and evil and angels and demons and things like that. I will tell you what I said a few weeks ago, as we talked about Egypt and the Assyrians and the Canaanites. Maybe the better way for us to look at this is not that Christianity or the Jews took these ideas, but that these ideas were passed on from the patriarchs, who passed on the oral traditions of the God who created everything. And these people, over time, begin to manipulate these stories and change them some. But there are elements of truth because of a shared common truth that came from all of creation, the Genesis account, and the biblical story, that it was passed on. So it's not that the Jews got it from anyone else, but rather they got it from the original stories. And they began to change some of these stories up. In the religion of the Zoroaster religion, there were no temples, there were no images, there were no sacrifices. They believed in the eternal fire. In fact, this religion is still practiced today. I think I saw a figure of some 2,000, 4,000 adherents. There are a number, apparently, of that here in the United States. And in their temples, there is still what they believe to be the eternal flame, the flame that continues to be fed 5 times a day and continues to burn over and over again. Well, what do we learn from the Persians? Well, I would call to your attention some of the same lessons that we've gotten from some of the larger empires so far, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians. That is, do not forget that God uses the kingdom of men to accomplish his will. It doesn't matter how strong and powerful they are. He is still the all-powerful, all-wise God, and he still has his purposes. And so, yes, it was God's plan for the Assyrians to punish the northern kingdom. And it was God's plan for the Babylonians to punish the southern kingdom. And for the Israelites to go into captivity. And we talked about last week, during the days of Jeremiah, there were prophets coming up saying, you know, the captivity is going to be short-lived and you're going to come back here. And Jeremiah comes and says, no, you're going to get in that land and you need to settle down and you need to build houses and you need to live there because you're going to be there for a while. This was part of God's plan. And so it is with the Persians. God used the Persians to release his people and bring them back to the land that he wanted them to be in, which after a period of some 400 years will be when Christ comes again. So this was all part of God's plan. And God was working to accomplish everything. And so he would use whoever he wanted to use, whoever he needed to use. It did not matter what their intention was. What mattered was his intention. And we need to remember that today. We are not privy to what God is thinking or how God is acting. Maybe sometimes today things happen just because, well, things happen. But maybe sometimes God is working behind the scenes. People wondered, you know, is the coronavirus, is this part of God's judgment? I don't know if it is or not. None of us will know until we find ourselves in heaven one day. and we see a larger sense of what God was accomplishing. We can't assume that it is, but I can't assume that it's not. And different countries that come on, North Korea, China, even the United States, God accomplishes what he needs to accomplish, and he will use whoever he needs to use in order to accomplish that. But maybe on a more personal level, we don't need to think just how God uses nations, because that sort of separates us from nations. I think another lesson here is God places people where he wants to accomplish his purposes. So you can think of the naming of King Cyrus 150 years before he was born. God intended to use him. And then as you look at the story of Esther, and you remember when Esther was hesitant to step in and save the people, and her uncle told her, God may have put you here for such a time as this. God's purposes are not so large that he cannot reach in and use individual people to accomplish those things. So, to fathers, you have an important task, and God is giving you that task. To mothers, you've got an important task, and God is using that task. Maybe that's why you're here at this moment. Maybe God is using you to raise up a generation of faithful people. Maybe God is using you to influence people for good. God works on a national level, but he also works Esther and Nehemiah to accomplish his purpose on a private, personal level as well. And that's a powerful lesson, I think. And that's what I think can touch our lives and maybe make us think a little bit more. Am I submitting to God? And how does God want to use me at your work? Who are the people that you can set a good example for? Who are the people who need to see someone living for Christ? Acts chapter 18, the Apostle Paul is preaching, and the people are rejecting his message, and he's frustrated. And Christ appears to him and says, I've still got many people in this city. And I take it from that, not at that moment, but people that Christ knew would come to him. Who are the people that Christ is going to use us to interact with who need to hear the gospel and need deliverance from God, that you and I can step in by his grace and by his providence? So don't discount the way that God can use individuals like Esther and Nehemiah to accomplish his great work. Well, the Persians fell. They fell to the Greeks. Next week, we will study the Greek Empire and begin by talking about the greatest general they ever had, Alexander the Great. I hope you'll be here next week. Got any questions, shoot them my way. You can shoot me an email. You see the email address there, mntmccrary@gmail.com. If I've gotten any information wrong, which is highly possible, I try to be as careful as I can, but there's so much information here. I may have missed something, or maybe I misstated something. Shoot me a line and let me know, and I'll fix that, and we'll get it rolling next time I go through this. If you want to give me a call, 502-245-0573. If I'm not there, leave a message. 415-5092, my home message. You can find me on Facebook. You can send me a message there. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much. I appreciate so many things you could be doing right now. You could be watching Netflix right now. But you've got an interest in spiritual things, and that's good. And I praise God for that and thank God for that. So God bless you. Be safe. And Lord willing, we'll see you again within the next few days.